Mother Bear helped rescue. Baby trapped after earthquake. What happened next put everyone in tears. Let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe if you're new to our channel. The morning light had barely touched the tops of the pine trees when the earth began to shake. Not a gentle tremor, but a violent upheaval that sent the residents of Pine Hollow scrambling from their beds in terror. Windows shattered, dishes crashed to floors, and the old wooden structures that had stood for generations began to splinter and collapse. In a remote cabin on the edge of the village, Sarah and Daniel Morgan clutched their 4-month-old daughter Emma close, desperately trying to shield her as their ceiling began to cave in. "The door!" Daniel shouted over the deafening roar of the quake. "We need to get outside." Sarah nodded, her face pale with fear as she wrapped Emma tighter in her blanket. They stumbled across the buckling floor, dodging falling debris. Just as they reached the doorway, a massive beam crashed down behind them, missing them by inches. The family burst outside into the chaos of their once peaceful mountain community, now transformed into a scene of devastation. They had barely made it 10 steps when another violent tremor knocked them off their feet. Sarah fell hard, and in that terrible moment, baby Emma slipped from her arms, rolling toward the collapsing porch of their cabin. Before either parent could react, the wooden structure gave way completely, sending a cascade of timber and roofing down exactly where their tiny daughter had landed. "Emma!" Sarah's scream pierced the morning air as she lunged forward, only to be pulled back by Daniel as another section of the house collapsed. "It's not stable," he cried, his voice breaking. "We can't just rush in there." Sarah sank to her knees in the dirt, tears streaming down her dust-covered face. "Our baby," she whispered. "She's under there." From beneath the rubble came a faint, muffled cry. Emma was alive but completely trapped. Just beyond the tree line, not more than 50 yards from the devastation, a large brown bear and her cub paused in their morning foraging. The mother bear's ears perked up, her sensitive hearing picking up sounds that did not belong in her forest: the rumble of the earth, the crash of falling structures, the cries of frightened humans. But something else caught her attention, something that made her head tilt with an almost human-like expression of concern: the faint, desperate cries of a baby. The bear's cub nuzzled against her leg, confused by his mother's sudden alertness. In any other circumstance, the mother bear would have guided her young one deeper into the forest, away from human presence. Instead, she took a hesitant step toward the village, her nose twitching as she scented the air. The cub followed, mimicking his mother's cautious movements. Meanwhile, the villagers who could still move were frantically trying to organize rescue efforts. Daniel had run to find help, leaving Sarah huddled near the rubble, talking softly to Emma, desperately trying to keep her calm with the sound of her voice. "Help is coming, sweetie," she called, her words barely audible through her tears. "Mommy's right here. Stay strong for Mommy." But as minutes stretched on with no sign of Daniel returning with help, Emma's cries began to grow weaker. Sarah felt her heart constricting with fear. The baby was so small, so fragile. How long could she survive under the weight of the collapsed porch? It was then that Sarah caught movement from the corner of her eye. Turning her head, she froze in absolute terror. Walking purposefully toward the ruins of her home was a massive brown bear with a small cub trailing behind. Sarah wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but fear paralyzed her completely. All she could do was watch as the mother bear approached the very spot where her baby lay trapped. The bear stopped at the edge of the rubble, her powerful nose working overtime as she sniffed at the debris. Then, to Sarah's astonishment, the animal began to paw carefully at the wreckage. Not wildly or destructively, but with surprising gentleness, as if she understood something fragile lay beneath. The cub watched curiously, occasionally mimicking his mother's movements but mostly staying clear of the larger pieces of wood and stone. Sarah remained frozen, torn between her instinctive fear of the wild predator and a growing, impossible hope. Because with each careful movement of the bear's massive paws, more debris shifted away from where Emma's cries originated. In the distance, she could hear voices approaching, Daniel returning with help. But would they arrive in time? And what would they do when they saw a wild bear digging through the rubble where a human baby lay trapped? Sarah held her breath as the mother bear dislodged a large beam, revealing a small hollow space beneath. And within it, wrapped in her now dirty pink blanket, lay baby Emma, her tiny face red from crying, but miraculously unharmed. The bear made a soft huffing sound, almost like a sigh of relief. With incredible delicacy, she used her claws to widen the opening, creating a path to the trapped infant. Sarah watched, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure the bear must hear it, as the massive creature lowered her head toward her vulnerable child. But instead of the horror Sarah expected, the mother bear gently nuzzled the baby, then carefully worked her snout under Emma's tiny body. With a movement of surprising tenderness, she lifted the infant free from the debris, holding her as carefully as she might handle her own cub. Emma's cries quieted almost immediately. Tears streamed freely down Sarah's dust-covered face. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what she was witnessing. The mother bear stood still, holding Emma gently in her jaws, not by the flesh but by the blanket wrapped around her. Their eyes met across the rubble, mother to mother. And in that moment, Sarah felt something profound pass between them, a connection that transcended species. Then came the sound of running footsteps and shocked exclamations as Daniel returned with a group of villagers. They froze at the edge of the clearing, taking in the impossible scene before them. The mother bear, seeming to understand that help had arrived, gently placed Emma on a patch of soft grass, clear of any debris. She backed away slowly, her cub following close behind. "Don't move," someone whispered urgently. "Bears are unpredictable. If we spook her—" But Sarah was already moving, crawling forward across the uneven ground toward her baby. The bear watched, making no aggressive moves, only a soft huffing sound, as the human mother reached her child and gathered her close, sobbing with relief. "She saved her," Sarah whispered, looking up at the circle of stunned faces. "The bear saved our baby." The bear and her cub lingered for just a moment longer. The mother animal made one more soft sound, almost like a goodbye, before turning and ambling back toward the forest, her curious cub close at her heels. The villagers watched in silent awe as the unlikely hero disappeared among the trees, leaving behind a story that none of them would ever forget. A story of compassion that knew no boundaries. As Sarah held Emma close, checking her for injuries and finding only minor scrapes, Daniel knelt beside them, wrapping his arms around his family. "It's a miracle," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. But Sarah shook her head, her eyes still fixed on the spot where the bear had vanished. "Not a miracle," she said softly, "a mother's love. It seems that speaks a universal language." The villagers gathered around the reunited family, many wiping tears from their eyes. In the midst of tragedy and destruction, they had witnessed something that defied explanation, something that would change how they viewed the world and their place in it forever. And deep in the forest, a mother bear nuzzled her cub affectionately, continuing their morning forage as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all, unaware that her simple act of compassion had forever tied two very different families together in a bond that transcended nature itself. In the days that followed, the small community of Pine Hollow began the painful process of rebuilding. The earthquake had claimed 3 lives, destroyed nearly half the homes, and left deep scars in both the landscape and the hearts of survivors. But amid the rubble and grief, the story of Emma's miraculous rescue spread from person to person, becoming a beacon of hope that lifted spirits and strengthened resolve. Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the bear. She would wake in the middle of the night, the image of those intelligent eyes looking into hers still vivid in her mind. Sometimes she would sit by the makeshift tent where they now lived, holding Emma close while staring at the tree line, wondering if the bear was out there, if she ever thought about the human baby she had saved. "You're looking for her again, aren't you?" Daniel asked one evening, settling beside his wife with a cup of weak coffee. They had salvaged what they could from their destroyed home and were waiting for help from the emergency services that had finally reached their remote community. "I can't help it," Sarah admitted, adjusting Emma in her arms. The baby was sleeping peacefully, showing no signs of trauma from her ordeal. "Every time I close my eyes, I see her. The way she looked at me, Daniel. It wasn't like looking at an animal. There was understanding there." Daniel put his arm around her shoulders. "The forest ranger says bears are extremely protective mothers. Maybe she heard Emma crying and somehow, I don't know, recognized another mother's distress." "It was more than that," Sarah insisted. "She could have easily hurt Emma, even accidentally, but she was so gentle, so careful. She knew exactly what she was doing." She looked down at their sleeping daughter. "I keep thinking about her cub. What if it had been trapped instead? Would I have had the courage to help?" Daniel didn't answer immediately, considering the question seriously. "I'd like to think any of us would, but fear makes people do strange things." He sighed, looking out at the darkening forest. "The ranger also said they're going to set up monitoring stations. They want to tag the bear if they can find her." "Tag her? Why?" Sarah tensed, instinctively holding Emma tighter. Standard procedure, apparently. A bear that approaches human settlements is considered a potential risk. "But she wasn't aggressive. She saved our daughter," Sarah protested, her voice rising enough to make Emma stir in her sleep. Daniel gently squeezed her shoulder. I know. I told them that. But they said bears that lose their natural fear of humans can become problems later. They're just being cautious." Sarah fell silent, a knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. The idea that the bear might be treated as a threat because of her compassionate act seemed profoundly unfair. She made a decision then, though she didn't share it with Daniel just yet. Somehow, she would find a way to protect the bear that had protected her child. The opportunity came sooner than she expected. The next morning, as volunteers distributed supplies and workers cleared debris, a Forest Service truck pulled into what remained of the village square. 2 uniformed rangers stepped out, carrying equipment that Sarah recognized as tracking gear. "They're going to start setting up wildlife cameras," Daniel explained when he saw her watching, "to monitor for the bear." Sarah nodded, then handed Emma to him. "Can you watch her for a bit? I want to help Mrs. Lawson sort through the donations." It wasn't entirely a lie. The elderly woman could use the assistance, but Sarah had other plans first. She approached the rangers as they unloaded their gear. "Excuse me," she said politely. "I'm Sarah Morgan. My baby was the one rescued by the bear." The older ranger nodded, his weathered face softening. "Yes, ma'am, we heard about that. Quite extraordinary." "It was," Sarah agreed, "and I'm concerned about your plans for her. The bear, I mean." The younger ranger exchanged a glance with his colleague. "Ma'am, we understand your feelings, but Our job is to ensure the safety of both the community and the wildlife. A bear that approaches humans." "She didn't just approach humans," Sarah interrupted, her voice firmer than she intended. "She saved my daughter's life when no one else could reach her. She showed more compassion than many people would have." The older ranger sighed, setting down the equipment case he was holding. "Mrs. Morgan, I've been working these woods for nearly 30 years. I've seen bears that seemed peaceful suddenly attack when they felt threatened. Your experience was unusual, to say the least. But we can't take chances, especially with a mother and cub." "What exactly are you planning to do if you find her?" Sarah pressed. "Observe first," the younger ranger explained. "If she stays away from the settlement, nothing. But if she keeps coming close, we'd tranquilize her, tag her for monitoring, and possibly relocate her and the cub if necessary." Sarah felt a wave of protectiveness surge through her. "The only reason she came near our homes was to help. She left immediately after. Doesn't that count for something?" Before either ranger could respond, a commotion arose from the far side of the clearing. People were pointing toward the tree line, voices raised in alarm. Sarah turned and felt her heart skip a beat. Standing at the edge of the forest, clearly visible but keeping her distance, was the mother bear. Her cub peeked out from behind her massive form, curious but cautious. "That's her," Sarah whispered, recognizing the distinctive white patch on the bear's chest. The rangers were already reaching for their rifles. Tranquilizer guns, Sarah hoped, but she couldn't be sure. Several men from the village were also moving forward, some carrying tools that could easily become weapons. "Wait." Sarah moved without thinking, placing herself between the villagers and the bear. "Please, everyone stay back. She's not here to hurt anyone." "Mrs. Morgan, step away," the older ranger called, his voice tense. "That's a wild animal with her cub. There's nothing more unpredictable." But Sarah stood her ground, heart pounding. "She saved my child. I won't let you hurt her for it." To everyone's amazement, the bear made no aggressive moves. She remained at the forest's edge, watching the humans with what Sarah could only describe as intelligent curiosity. The cub stayed close to its mother, occasionally standing on hind legs to get a better view before dropping back to all fours. Slowly, carefully, Sarah took a step toward the bear, ignoring the gasps and warnings from behind her. "Sarah," Daniel's voice cut through the tension. "What are you doing?" She didn't turn around. "It's okay," she called back softly. "She won't hurt me." Sarah continued forward, stopping when she was halfway between the villagers and the bear. She stood still, breathing deeply to calm herself. The bear watched, her dark eyes fixed on Sarah's face. "Thank you," Sarah said simply, her voice carrying in the hushed silence that had fallen over the clearing. "You saved my Emma, and I won't let them hurt you for it." As if understanding the words, the bear made a soft huffing sound. She looked past Sarah to the gathered humans, then back to Sarah's face. Something passed between them in that moment. Not communication in any human sense, but a form of understanding that transcended language. Then, with deliberate calm, the bear turned and ambled back into the forest, her cub following close behind. She paused once at the tree line, looking back as if to ensure Sarah understood. She had come not to cause trouble, but to check on the strange little hairless cub she had rescued. The silence that followed the bear's departure was broken by the older ranger's low whistle. "In 30 years, he said, shaking his head in disbelief, "I've never seen anything like that." The younger ranger lowered his rifle. "It almost seemed like she recognized you." Sarah nodded, still looking at the spot where the bear had disappeared. "She did, and I recognized her." She turned to face the rangers. Will you still try to tag her?" The men exchanged uncertain glances. "We should follow protocol," the younger one began, but his colleague cut him off. "I think," the older ranger said slowly, "that this situation might warrant some flexibility in our approach. If the bear keeps its distance except for this one incident, perhaps we can simply monitor without intervention." Relief flooded through Sarah. "Thank you," she whispered. By evening, the story of Sarah's confrontation with the bear had spread throughout the recovery camp, growing with each retelling until some versions had the bear bowing to Sarah, or Sarah speaking in bear language. Emma became something of a celebrity, with people coming by the Morgan family's tent just to see the miracle baby, who had formed a bond with a wild bear. Dr. Eliza Chen, a wildlife biologist who had arrived with the emergency response team, sought out Sarah after hearing the stories. "I'd like to document what happened," she explained, her eyes bright with academic interest. "There are very few verified cases of wild predators showing this kind of behavior toward human infants. It could be important for our understanding of animal cognition and empathy." Sarah agreed to tell her story, but with conditions. "You have to promise that your research won't lead to her being captured or harmed in any way. She deserves to live in peace with her cub." Dr. Chen nodded. "Of course. Actually, I'm more interested in observing from a distance. If you're willing, I'd like to set up some cameras near where your cabin stood. If the bear does return, we could learn more about her behavior without interfering." "You think she'll come back?" Sarah asked, surprised. The biologist shrugged. "It's possible. She's shown unusual interest already. Bears have excellent memories and can recognize individual humans. Your scents are familiar to her now." The thought was both unsettling and somehow comforting to Sarah. As the days passed and the initial shock of the disaster began to fade, she found herself drawn to the ruins of their home. Daniel was busy helping with the community rebuilding efforts, and Sarah would often walk there with Emma in her arms, sitting on a fallen log and simply watching the forest. It was on one such afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after the earthquake, that Sarah sensed she wasn't alone. Emma was sleeping against her chest, and the forest seemed unusually quiet. Slowly, Sarah turned her head to look behind her. The mother bear stood about 20 yards away, her cub playing nearby, rolling a pine cone between his paws. The bear made no move to come closer, but she wasn't retreating either. She was simply watching. Sarah remained perfectly still, afraid that any movement might frighten the animal away. "Hello again," she said softly. The bear's ears twitched at the sound of her voice. Then, to Sarah's amazement, the massive creature lowered herself to the ground, assuming a relaxed position while still keeping a watchful eye on both Sarah and her own cub. They stayed that way for nearly an hour. 2 mothers from different worlds, sharing a peaceful moment in the afternoon sun. When Emma woke and began to fuss, the bear lifted her head, alert but not alarmed. Sarah soothed the baby, speaking in gentle tones, aware of the bear observing the interaction with evident interest. Before Sarah left, she looked directly at the bear and said, "I'll come back tomorrow if you'd like." She felt slightly foolish speaking to a wild animal as if it could understand, yet something told her that on some level, it did. True to her word, Sarah returned the next day, and the next. Not always at the same time, but always to the same spot. Sometimes the bear would be waiting. Other times she would appear silently from among the trees. Always, she kept a respectful distance, never approaching too closely, but never showing fear either. The cub grew more adventurous with each visit, sometimes venturing halfway toward Sarah before its mother would huff a warning call. Dr. Chen was ecstatic when Sarah finally told her about these meetings. "This is unprecedented," the biologist explained, her words tumbling out in excitement. "A sustained, peaceful interaction between a wild bear and a human, especially involving an infant. I need to document this. Would you allow me to observe from a blind? I promise I won't interfere." Sarah hesitated but eventually agreed, with the understanding that no one else would be told about the meetings just yet. She wasn't ready to share this special connection with the wider world. As summer waned into autumn, a strange routine developed. 3 times a week, Sarah would walk to the clearing where their cabin had once stood, now cleared of debris as rebuilding plans were developed. Sometimes Dr. Chen would be hidden nearby, quietly documenting the encounters. The bear, whom Sarah had started calling Maple, for the distinctive pattern in her fur that reminded her of autumn leaves, would often be waiting. On one particularly golden afternoon in late September, something extraordinary happened. Emma, now nearly 8 months old and sitting up on her own, was playing with a colorful rattle on the blanket Sarah had spread on the ground. Maple watched from her usual spot, her cub, significantly larger now, dozing beside her. Without warning, a red fox darted from the underbrush, startled by something in the forest behind it. The sudden movement and appearance of a new animal caused Emma to let out a surprised cry. Before Sarah could even react, Maple was on her feet, her posture not threatening but protective as she positioned herself between the fox and the humans. The fox froze, clearly assessing the much larger predator, then slunk away into the trees. Maple remained standing, scanning the area thoroughly before finally settling back down, though closer than she had ever positioned herself before, perhaps 30 feet from Sarah and Emma. Sarah's heart raced as she realized what had just happened. The bear had acted protectively, not just toward her own cub, but toward Emma as well. When she recounted the event to Dr. Chen later, the biologist was beyond excited. "This suggests she's incorporated you and Emma into her perception of family group or protected individuals," she explained. "It's similar to behaviors we sometimes see in mixed species groups in the wild, but almost never involving humans and large predators." "What does it mean?" Sarah asked, both awed and slightly worried by the implications. Dr. Chen removed her glasses, cleaning them thoughtfully before replying. "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure, but I think it means we understand far less about animal consciousness and social bonds than we thought we did." She smiled suddenly. "It also means your daughter has the most unusual babysitter in recorded history." As word of these extraordinary interactions spread beyond Pine Hollow, media attention followed. Journalists began arriving in the small community, eager for a glimpse of the miracle bear and the baby she had saved. Most were disappointed. Maple seemed to sense the presence of strangers and would not appear when unfamiliar people were in the area. The attention brought complications. Wildlife officials from the state arrived, concerned about public safety and the potential for disaster if the bear's behavior changed. There were heated meetings in the community center, with some residents arguing that the bear posed too great a risk, and others, led passionately by Sarah, defending Maple's right to remain free and undisturbed. "She has never shown a single aggressive action toward any human," Sarah argued during one particularly tense town meeting. "In fact, she's demonstrated more compassion than many people I've known." "Mrs. Morgan," countered the state wildlife director, a stern woman named Victoria Reeves, "your experience, while touching, is an anomaly. Bears are wild animals with unpredictable behavior. The more comfortable this bear becomes around humans, the more likely someone will eventually get hurt." The debate might have continued indefinitely, if not for an unexpected development. A major wildlife conservation foundation, having heard about Maple through Dr. Chen's preliminary research papers, offered to purchase a significant tract of land surrounding Pine Hollow and establish it as a protected wildlife sanctuary. The bear and her cub would be protected. The community would benefit from the tourism and jobs the sanctuary would bring, and researchers would have a unique opportunity to study this extraordinary animal relationship. There were conditions, of course. Strict protocols would need to be established for any human-bear interactions. Sarah would need to work with wildlife experts to ensure safety remained the priority, and the media frenzy would need to be carefully managed to prevent Maple from being overwhelmed by curious onlookers. But as winter approached and the details were being finalized, Sarah couldn't help feeling that something miraculous had emerged from the tragedy of the earthquake. Standing once again at the edge of the clearing, Emma bundled warmly against the November chill in her arms. She watched Maple and her now nearly grown cub foraging for the last autumn berries. "You changed everything," Sarah said softly, not sure if she was speaking to the bear or to Emma, or perhaps to some greater force that had brought them together in such unlikely circumstances. "You showed us that compassion exists everywhere if we're willing to see it." As if hearing her words, Maple looked up, her dark eyes meeting Sarah's across the clearing. In that moment of connection, Sarah felt she understood something profound about the world and their place in it. Something about the thin lines that separate species, about the universal language of motherhood, and about the extraordinary capacity for kindness that exists in the most unexpected places. The bear huffed softly, a sound Sarah had come to recognize as greeting or acknowledgement. Then she turned, nudging her cub gently, and together they ambled deeper into the forest that would now forever be their protected home. Daniel joined Sarah, wrapping an arm around her shoulders as they watched the bears disappear among the trees. "The foundation called," he said quietly. "Everything's been approved. Construction on the visitor center starts in spring." Sarah nodded, leaning into his embrace. "Do you think we're doing the right thing? All this attention, the sanctuary. Sometimes I worry we're changing her life too much." "Her life changed the moment she decided to dig our daughter out of the rubble," Daniel pointed out. "Just like ours did. But now she'll be protected, studied respectfully, and maybe—" He hesitated, looking down at Emma's peaceful face. "Maybe we'll learn something important from her. Something about bridging the gaps between us and the natural world." Sarah smiled, thinking of all the impossible moments that had led them here. A devastating earthquake, a bear's inexplicable act of compassion, and the countless small decisions and connections that had followed. "I think we already have," she said softly. As they turned to walk back to the village, now bustling with rebuilding activity, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace. The story of the mother bear and the baby she rescued would be told for generations, inspiring conservation efforts and challenging assumptions about the boundaries between species. But for Sarah, it would always be something more intimate, a reminder that in the darkest moments, help can come from the most unexpected sources, and that the capacity for kindness transcends all barriers we think exist between ourselves and the wider world. And somewhere in the forest that would now be preserved forever, a mother bear continued teaching her growing cub the ways of their woodland home, unaware that her single act of compassion had not only saved a human child, but had changed the relationship between her kind and humans in ways that would ripple outward for years to come. 5 years passed, transforming Pine Hollow from a disaster zone into something more beautiful than it had been before. The wildlife sanctuary had flourished, drawing researchers, conservationists, and respectful tourists from around the world. The visitor center, designed to blend harmoniously with the forest surrounding it, featured educational exhibits about local wildlife, forest ecology, and most prominently, the extraordinary story of Maple the bear and Emma Morgan. Emma was now a bright, curious kindergartner with a head full of auburn curls and an unusual fearlessness around animals that sometimes worried her parents. She had no conscious memory of being rescued from the earthquake rubble, of course, but she had grown up with the story, told and retold until it became part of her identity. In her bedroom hung a painting by a local artist depicting a mother bear gently carrying a baby wrapped in a pink blanket. It was the first thing she saw each morning when she woke. "Can we go see Maple today?" Emma asked one Saturday morning in early spring, as she did almost every weekend. She was coloring a picture of a bear family at the kitchen table while Sarah prepared breakfast. "Not today, sweetheart," Sarah replied, setting down a plate of pancakes shaped like bear faces, a weekend tradition. "Remember, we talked about how bears sleep through the winter? Maple might be awake now that it's getting warmer, but Dr. Chen says we should give her some space while she's teaching her new cubs how to find food." Emma's eyes widened. "She has new babies? More than one?" Sarah nodded, smiling at her daughter's excitement. 3 new cubs, according to the trail cameras. Dr. Chen showed me the pictures yesterday. They're about the size of small puppies right now, all fuzzy and wobbly on their feet. "Will they be my friends too, like Maple?" Daniel, entering the kitchen in time to hear this question, exchanged a look with Sarah. They had always walked a careful line in how they explained Emma's special relationship with the bear. They wanted her to appreciate the extraordinary connection without developing a dangerous overconfidence around wild animals. "Maple is special," Daniel said, taking a seat beside his daughter. "But she's still a wild animal, not a pet, and new mother bears are even more protective of their babies than usual. We need to be extra respectful of her space right now." Emma considered this solemnly as she cut into her pancakes. "Doctor, Chen says I'm the only human baby in the whole world who was saved by a bear," she said finally, with the casual pride of a child stating an exceptional fact about herself. "That makes me a little bit magic, doesn't it?" Sarah smiled, running a hand over her daughter's curls. "It makes you very special, and it means you have a very important job to help other people understand why we need to protect animals like Maple and their homes." This was something Emma took very seriously. Even at 5, she had already appeared in several educational videos produced by the sanctuary, telling her story, with considerable dramatic embellishments, and explaining to other children why forests and the animals that lived in them were important. She had become something of a mascot for the conservation efforts centered around Pine Hollow. After breakfast, as Emma returned to her coloring, Sarah stepped outside onto the porch of their new home, built not far from where their original cabin had stood. The morning air was crisp with the promise of spring, and from where she stood, she could see the visitor center in the distance, its eco-friendly design nestling among the trees rather than imposing upon them. Daniel joined her, handing her a steaming mug of coffee. "Penny, for your thoughts." Sarah sipped the coffee before answering. "I was just thinking about how much has changed because of one moment. One choice made by a bear who should, by all natural instincts, have ignored a human baby or even seen it as a threat to her own cub." "Nature is full of surprises," Daniel replied, slipping an arm around her waist. "And speaking of surprises, did Chen tell you about the university grant?" Sarah nodded, excitement bubbling up again at the news. "A 5-year extension for the research program. She was practically dancing when she told me, and they want to expand the focus to include other potential instances of cross-species empathy. Apparently, Maple isn't the only animal showing unexpected behaviors." "Oh?" Daniel raised an eyebrow, curious. "There's a pod of dolphins in Australia that's been working cooperatively with human fishermen for generations, and some elephants in an African sanctuary that adopted an orphaned antelope." She smiled. Chen thinks we're just beginning to understand the emotional complexity of animals. She says what happened with Maple and Emma might be unusual, but not as unprecedented as we first thought. Daniel was quiet for a moment, watching a pair of chickadees darting among the new spring leaves. You know, my grandfather used to tell stories about animals helping people. I always thought they were just folk tales, meant to teach kids to be kind to animals. Now, I wonder if some of them might have been based on real events. Sarah leaned against him, thinking about the folk tales and children's stories from around the world that featured kind-hearted animals coming to the aid of humans. Maybe humans and animals have been forming these bonds throughout history, and we've just been too quick to dismiss the stories as myths or exaggerations. Their peaceful moment was interrupted by the ringing of Sarah's phone. She checked the screen and straightened. It's Chen, and that's odd. She rarely calls on weekends unless it's important. The conversation was brief, but by the time Sarah hung up, her expression had shifted from concern to something like wonder. We need to go to the sanctuary, now. What's wrong? Daniel asked immediately. Nothing's wrong, Sarah assured him, already moving back toward the house. But Chen has set up a blind near one of Maple's favorite clearings. She's been there since dawn, observing the new family. She paused, her eyes bright with emotion. Maple brought her cubs to the edge of the clearing closest to our old cabin site. Chen thinks she's been trying to show them to us. Within half an hour, the Morgan family was following Dr. Chen along a secluded trail that few visitors to the sanctuary were permitted to use. Emma, who'd been quick to agree to the strictest rules of quiet and careful movement, walked between her parents, practically vibrating with excitement. Remember, Dr. Chen reminded them in a whisper as they approached the camouflaged blind she had constructed. We're incredibly privileged to observe bears this closely in the wild. Most researchers go their entire careers without such an opportunity. No sudden movements, no loud noises, and absolutely no attempting to approach them. We observe only. Emma nodded solemnly. I promise to be super quiet, Dr. Chen. I won't scare Maple's babies. The wildlife biologist smiled down at the little girl. Over the years, she had developed a genuine fondness for the Morgan family, particularly Emma, whose natural curiosity and respectful attitude toward animals belied her young age. I know you'll be perfect, Emma. That's why I called your parents. Not many children would get this opportunity. Inside the blind, Chen had set up several high-definition cameras and a pair of powerful spotting scopes on tripods. She helped Emma up onto a stool in front of one of them, carefully adjusting it to her height. Look through here, she whispered, and tell me what you see. Emma pressed her eye to the scope, then gave a tiny gasp of delight. In the clearing about 100 yards away, clearly visible through the scope, was Maple. The bear had grown larger and her fur thicker over the years, but the distinctive white patch on her chest made her immediately recognizable. She was lying in a patch of early spring sunlight, seemingly relaxed as 3 small cubs tumbled and played around her. I see them, Emma whispered, her voice filled with awe. They're beautiful. Sarah took a turn at the second scope, her heart swelling at the sight of the bear who had saved her daughter, now a mother 3 times over. Maple looked healthy and content, occasionally nudging one of her cubs with her nose when their play became too rough. She's been here for about 3 hours, Chen explained quietly. Initially, she was keeping the cubs closer to the forest edge, which is normal. But gradually, she's been moving closer to this side of the clearing. The biologist hesitated, then added, The interesting thing is, this isn't typically prime bear habitat. There are better feeding grounds to the north, but Maple consistently brings her cubs to this particular area. It's close to where our cabin was, Sarah noted, where she found Emma. Chen nodded. Exactly. Bears have excellent spatial memory and can remember feeding sights years later. But this goes beyond that. She appears to be deliberately bringing her offspring to a location with significant history. Daniel, who had been quietly observing, asked, "Is it possible she's trying to teach them something about humans? About coexistence?" "It's not as far-fetched as it sounds," Chen replied. "We know bear cubs learn complex behaviors from their mothers, including which foods are safe, which areas to avoid, and how to interact with other species. In areas where bears and humans have coexisted peacefully for generations, bears often show less fear and more tolerance of human presence." As they watched, one of the cubs, slightly larger than the others, and with a distinctive dark patch around one eye, broke away from the playgroup and took a few tentative steps toward the blind. Maple immediately raised her head, alert but not alarmed. The cub continued its curious exploration for a few more steps before Maple made a soft huffing sound. Immediately, the cub turned and scampered back to its mother. "She's setting boundaries," Chen whispered, "teaching them where it's safe to explore and where they should be cautious." Emma, who had been watching intently, whispered, "She remembers me, doesn't she? That's why she comes here." The adults exchanged glances. It was a complex question with no simple answer, especially for a 5-year-old. But before any of them could respond, something extraordinary happened. Maple rose to her feet, gathering her cubs with gentle nudges. Then, facing directly toward the blind as if she knew exactly where they were hidden, she sat back on her haunches in what almost looked like a deliberate pose. The cubs, following their mother's example, sat beside her. For a long moment, the bear family and the human family observed each other across the clearing, separated by distance and species but connected by an inexplicable bond. Then Maple made a soft sound, different from her warning huff, almost like a gentle woof. She rose, nudged her cubs into motion, and with unhurried dignity led them back into the forest. "Did you see that?" Chen whispered, her scientific detachment momentarily forgotten in the face of what they had witnessed. It was almost like she was introducing her family to us, Sarah finished softly. They remained in the blind for another hour, but Maple and her cubs did not return. As they finally made their way back toward the visitor center, Emma walked ahead with Dr. Chen, asking eager questions about the cubs and their development. Sarah and Daniel followed a few paces behind, hands linked. "Do you ever wonder," Sarah asked quietly, "what would have happened if Maple hadn't found Emma that day? If she had just walked past our cabin like any other bear would have?" Daniel squeezed her hand. "I try not to think about it. But I do wonder what made her different. What made her stop and help instead of running away?" "Maybe she's not different," Sarah suggested. "Maybe animals have always had this capacity for compassion, and we've just never given them the opportunity or recognition. Maybe Maple is showing us what's possible when we see beyond our differences." The conversation stayed with Sarah long after they returned home. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed, she sat at her desk in the small home office she shared with Daniel and opened her laptop. For years, she had been collecting stories, testimonials from people around the world who claimed to have experienced extraordinary acts of kindness or protection from wild animals. Most had been dismissed as exaggerations or misinterpretations, just as her own story might have been without the multiple witnesses and Dr. Chen's meticulous documentation. She began typing, as she had done many nights before, but tonight with renewed purpose. The working title of her manuscript glowed on the screen: Compassion Beyond Boundaries, Rethinking Human-Animal Relationships. What had begun as a personal journal of her experiences with Maple had gradually evolved into a serious book project, combining scientific research, historical accounts, and her own extraordinary story. Chen had contributed several chapters on the neurological and evolutionary basis for empathy in mammals, while Sarah focused on collecting and verifying similar stories from around the globe. The manuscript had already attracted interest from a major publisher specializing in nature and conservation titles. Tonight, Sarah added a new passage describing Maple's apparent introduction of her cubs. As she wrote, she reflected on how a single moment of connection between species had expanded into something that neither she nor anyone else could have predicted. A research center, a sanctuary, a book, and most importantly, a growing understanding that the lines between humans and other animals might be far more permeable than previously thought. The following morning, Sarah was awakened by Emma bouncing excitedly on the edge of the bed. "Mom! Dad! There's something outside. Come see!" Startled from sleep, both parents hurried to follow their daughter to the front window. Sarah gasped when she saw what had caused Emma's excitement. In the early morning light, clearly visible at the edge of their yard, where the forest began, were fresh bear tracks. One large set and 3 tiny sets pressed into the soft earth. "Maple brought her babies to our house," Emma whispered, her face glowing with wonder. "She wanted them to know where I live." Daniel immediately went to check the security cameras they had installed around the property, not out of fear, but as part of their agreement with the sanctuary to document any bear visits. The footage showed Maple and her 3 cubs passing through their yard just before dawn, moving slowly and with apparent purpose. The bear had paused near the porch steps, looking directly at the house for several long moments before leading her cubs back into the forest. "Should we call Chen?" Daniel asked, reviewing the footage with a mix of awe and concern. Sarah considered for a moment, then shook her head. Sarah considered for a moment, then shook her head. "Let's wait. If Maple is expanding her cubs' understanding of their territory to include our home, we should let it happen naturally." She knelt beside Emma, who was still staring at the tracks with fascination. "But this means we need to be extra careful and respectful, okay? No leaving food outside, no trying to find Maple on your own, and always let us know if you see her near the house." Emma nodded solemnly, though her eyes still shone with excitement. "Can I draw a picture for Maple and leave it by the trees?" Sarah smiled at her daughter's innocence. "That's a lovely thought, sweetheart. But how about we draw the picture and keep it inside? We can take a photo for your scrapbook of Maple memories instead." As Emma ran to get her art supplies, Daniel pulled Sarah into a gentle embrace. "You know," he murmured against her hair, "when we first moved back here after the earthquake, I had nightmares about bears attacking our home, taking Emma. I was terrified that building so close to the forest was a mistake." "And now?" Sarah asked, looking up at him. Daniel smiled, glancing at the bear tracks visible from their window. "Now, I think we're exactly where we're supposed to be. Part of something important. Something that might change how people see their relationship with the natural world." Throughout that spring and summer, Maple's visits became a semi-regular occurrence. Always at dawn or dusk, always brief and respectful of boundaries. She never attempted to approach the house closely or showed any aggressive behavior. It seemed to Sarah that the bear was deliberately acclimating her cubs to human presence in the most controlled, careful way possible, teaching them that humans could be observed safely from a distance, but should not be approached carelessly. Dr. Chen, when finally informed of these visits, was beside herself with excitement. "This is unprecedented documented behavior," she explained during one of her now regular dinners with the Morgan family. "Bears typically teach their cubs to avoid human settlements entirely, or, in the case of problem bears, to associate them with food. Maple is demonstrating a remarkably nuanced approach, neither avoidance nor dependence, but a kind of respectful coexistence. The biologist's research team had expanded to include several graduate students specifically studying Maple and her offspring. Trail cameras throughout the sanctuary captured the bear family's movements, while careful observations noted their feeding patterns, social interactions, and responses to human activity. The most fascinating thing, Chen continued, accepting a second helping of Daniel's venison stew, is how Maple seems to be raising cubs who are neither fearful of nor aggressive toward humans, but maintain a healthy caution. If this behavioral pattern is passed down to the next generation, we could be witnessing the development of a localized bear culture that includes peaceful coexistence with humans as a part of their understanding of their environment. Emma, who had been permitted to join the adult conversation due to her special connection to the subject, asked, "Does that mean Maple's babies will teach their babies about us too?" Chen smiled at the little girl. "That's exactly what it might mean, Emma. And that's why what's happening here is so important. Most human-wildlife conflicts happen because neither side understands how to coexist with the other. Your special friend Maple might be showing us a better way." As the seasons turned and Emma started first grade, the story of Maple and the sanctuary continued to gain attention beyond Pine Hollow. A documentary film crew from a major nature channel spent several weeks following Dr. Chen and her team, including respectful interviews with the Morgan family. Sarah's book was moving toward publication, with advance reviews calling it a revolutionary perspective on cross-species empathy and a beautiful blend of personal narrative and scientific inquiry. But perhaps the most significant development came in late autumn, when representatives from 3 other communities reached out to the Pine Hollow Sanctuary with an unusual request. They wanted to establish similar protected areas in regions where human-wildlife conflicts had been increasing. "They want to use our model," Chen explained excitedly during an impromptu meeting at the visitor center. "Not just the conservation aspects, but the educational approach, teaching people about the complex emotional and social lives of the animals they share territory with, and developing strategies for mutually beneficial coexistence. Let's wait. If Maple is expanding her cubs' understanding of their territory to include our home, we should let it happen naturally." She knelt beside Emma, who was still staring at the tracks with fascination. "But this means we need to be extra careful and respectful, okay? No leaving food outside, no trying to find Maple on your own, and always, always let us know if you see her near the house." Emma nodded solemnly, though her eyes still shone with excitement. "Can I draw a picture for Maple and leave it by the trees?" Sarah smiled at her daughter's innocence. "That's a lovely thought, sweetheart. But how about we draw the picture and keep it inside? We can take a photo for your scrapbook of Maple memories instead." As Emma ran to get her art supplies, Daniel pulled Sarah into a gentle embrace. "You know," he murmured against her hair, "when we first moved back here after the earthquake, I had nightmares about bears attacking our home, taking Emma. I was terrified that building so close to the forest was a mistake." "And now?" Sarah asked, looking up at him. Daniel smiled, glancing at the bear tracks visible from their window. "Now, I think we're exactly where we're supposed to be. Part of something important. Something that might change how people see their relationship with the natural world." Throughout that spring and summer, Maple's visits became a semi-regular occurrence. Always at dawn or dusk, always brief and respectful of boundaries. She never attempted to approach the house closely or showed any aggressive behavior. It seemed to Sarah that the bear was deliberately acclimating her cubs to human presence in the most controlled, careful way possible, teaching them that humans could be observed safely from a distance, but should not be approached carelessly. Dr. Chen, when finally informed of these visits, was beside herself with excitement. "This is unprecedented documented behavior," she explained during one of her now regular dinners with the Morgan family. Bears typically teach their cubs to avoid human settlements entirely, or, in the case of problem bears, to associate them with food. Maple is demonstrating a remarkably nuanced approach, neither avoidance nor dependence, but a kind of respectful coexistence. The biologist's research team had expanded to include several graduate students specifically studying Maple and her offspring. Trail cameras throughout the sanctuary captured the bear family's movements, while careful observations noted their feeding patterns, social interactions, and responses to human activity. "The most fascinating thing," Chen continued, accepting a second helping of Daniel's venison stew, "is how Maple seems to be raising cubs who are neither fearful of nor aggressive toward humans, but maintain a healthy caution. If this behavioral pattern is passed down to the next generation, we could be witnessing the development of a localized bear culture that includes peaceful coexistence with humans as part of their understanding of their environment." Emma, who had been permitted to join the adult conversation due to her special connection to the subject, asked, "Does that mean Maple's babies will teach their babies about us too?" Chen smiled at the little girl. "That's exactly what it might mean, Emma. And that's why what's happening here is so important. Most human-wildlife conflicts happen because neither side understands how to coexist with the other. Your special friend Maple might be showing us a better way." As the seasons turned and Emma started first grade, the story of Maple and the sanctuary continued to gain attention beyond Pine Hollow. A documentary film crew from a major nature channel spent several weeks following Dr. Chen and her team, including respectful interviews with the Morgan family. Sarah's book was moving toward publication, with advance reviews calling it a revolutionary perspective on cross-species empathy and a beautiful blend of personal narrative and scientific inquiry. But perhaps the most significant development came in late autumn, when representatives from 3 other communities reached out to the Pine Hollow Sanctuary with an unusual request. They wanted to establish similar protected areas in regions where human-wildlife conflicts had been increasing. "They want to use our model," Chen explained excitedly during an impromptu meeting at the visitor center. "Not just the conservation aspects, but the educational approach, teaching people about the complex emotional and social lives of the animals they share territory with, and developing strategies for mutually beneficial coexistence." "Are you nervous?" Sarah asked, coming to stand beside her daughter. At 42, Sarah's face showed fine lines around her eyes, lines of laughter and wonder that had deepened over years of extraordinary experiences. Emma shook her head, her auburn curls, so like her mother's, catching the sunlight. "Not nervous, just, I don't know, it feels important, doesn't it, like everything's coming full circle." Sarah nodded, understanding completely. Today marked a significant transition. Maple, now an elderly bear by wild standards, had been showing signs of age. Her movements had slowed, and she spent more time resting in the sun. Her 3 cubs from that pivotal spring 10 years ago were now adults with territories of their own. One daughter, the one they had named Shadow for the dark patch around her eye, had cubs of her own now, continuing a lineage that carried the remarkable behavioral patterns Maple had established. Most significantly, today was the official opening of the Emma Morgan Center for Interspecies Communication, a research facility built with international funding that would bring together experts from various fields to study the growing evidence of complex emotional and social intelligence in non-human animals. "Do you think she'll come?" Emma asked quietly. They hadn't seen Maple in nearly 2 months. Not unusual for this time of year, but somehow Emma had hoped the bear would sense the significance of this day. "If she does, it will be on her terms," Sarah replied, echoing the philosophy that had guided their approach to this remarkable relationship from the beginning. That's the most important thing we've learned, isn't it? We don't control this connection, we honor it. Emma nodded, looking out at the clearing where, as a baby, she had been rescued from earthquake rubble by a creature who, by all conventional wisdom, should have ignored her or viewed her as a threat. The place where years later she had watched in awe as Maple introduced her cubs to Emma's family in what could only be described as a deliberate social interaction. "Dad says the film crew is ready whenever we are," Emma said after a comfortable silence. "And Dr. Chen wants to do one final sound check before the guests arrive." Sarah smiled, thinking of her husband who had become the sanctuary's operations director over the years, overseeing the practical aspects while she focused on education and outreach. "We'll be there in a few minutes. I think we both needed this moment, just the two of us, where it all began." As they turned to leave, a sound stopped them, a familiar huffing breath that they would recognize anywhere. Both turned slowly, hardly daring to believe it. At the far edge of the clearing stood Maple, her once dark fur now grizzled with age. The white chest patch that had always identified her now expanded across more of her broad chest. She moved with the careful deliberation of an elderly matriarch, her powerful body showing the effects of years spent in the wild. But her eyes, those intelligent, soulful eyes, were as alert and knowing as ever. And beside her stood Shadow, now a magnificent adult female in her prime, with 3 small cubs tumbling playfully around her feet. 3 generations of bears, appearing on this of all days, as if they understood the significance of the moment. Emma slowly raised her camera, capturing the scene with hands that trembled slightly with emotion. Sarah stood perfectly still, overwhelmed by the timing of this visit. Neither spoke, afraid to break the spell of the moment. For several minutes, the bears remained at the edge of the clearing, the cubs playing while the older bears watched the humans with what could only be described as recognition. Then, in a gesture that took Sarah's breath away, Maple lowered herself to a sitting position, facing them directly, the same pose she had adopted years ago when first introducing her cubs. Shadow mimicked the posture, and even the cubs settled momentarily, creating a family portrait that seemed deliberately composed. "She knows," Emma whispered, tears streaming down her face as she continued to photograph the scene. "Somehow, she knows what today means." Sarah could only nod, her own eyes blurred with tears. After all these years of scientific observation and documentation, after countless debates with colleagues about anthropomorphism and the dangers of projecting human motivations onto animal behavior, she still found herself confronted with moments like this. Moments that defied conventional explanation, but resonated with the truth she felt in her bones. The bears remained for perhaps 10 minutes, an unusually long time for such an exposed position. Then Maple rose with the careful movements of age, made a soft sound to Shadow and the cubs, and led her family back into the deeper forest. Before disappearing entirely, the old bear paused, looking back at Sarah and Emma one final time. "Goodbye, old friend," Sarah whispered, somehow knowing in her heart that this might be the last time they would see the bear who had changed everything. "Thank you for showing us the way." As they walked back toward the new research center where hundreds of people would soon gather to celebrate its opening, Emma linked her arm through her mother's. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "when I was little, I used to imagine that Maple could understand every word we said, that she was almost human in how she thought about us." Sarah smiled. "And now?" "Now I think that was wrong," Emma replied. "She was never like a human. That was never what made her special." She paused, choosing her words carefully. What made her special was that she was fully bear, with all the instincts and intelligence that involves, and still found a way to connect with us across that difference. She didn't have to become like us to show compassion. "That's exactly right," Sarah said, feeling a surge of pride in her daughter's wisdom. "And that's what the center is really about, isn't it? Not teaching animals to be more human, but learning to recognize and respect the complex inner lives they already have." The research center came into view, its innovative architecture designed to harmonize with the forest surroundings rather than dominate them. People were already beginning to arrive: scientists, conservationists, educators, policymakers, and ordinary citizens who had been touched by the story of Maple and Emma. Daniel met them at the entrance, immediately sensing that something significant had happened. "You saw her, didn't you?" he asked, recognizing the look on their faces. Sarah nodded. All of them. 3 generations, right there in the clearing. It was like they came to give their blessing. He wrapped an arm around each of them, the family drawing strength from each other as they prepared to face the crowd and the cameras, to once again tell the extraordinary story that had begun with a collapsed cabin, a trapped baby, and a bear who defied all expectations. Later that evening, after the speeches and ribbon-cutting and interviews were finally done, the Morgan family returned to their home at the edge of the sanctuary. The house had expanded over the years, but the porch where they now sat together was original, the place where they had first noticed Maple's tracks, where they had watched countless sunsets while discussing new discoveries about the bears and other wildlife that shared their expanded sanctuary. "I've been thinking," Daniel said, breaking a comfortable silence, "about what Maple's legacy really is, beyond the research, beyond the sanctuary, beyond all the practical outcomes." "What did you come up with?" Sarah asked, her head resting against his shoulder as they watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Hope," he said simply. "In a world where we hear so much about conflict and destruction and species disappearing, Maple gave us a glimpse of another possibility. A future where different species might find ways to coexist not by accident or necessity, but through genuine recognition of each other." Emma, curled up on the porch swing with her ever-present notebook, looked up. "Doctor? Chen says there's growing evidence that many animals have a capacity for what we might call cross-species empathy, that it's not as rare as we once thought. Maybe what happened with Maple and me wasn't a miracle. Maybe it was just a reminder of something that's always been possible, if we're open to seeing it." Sarah thought about her daughter's words long after Emma and Daniel had gone inside. She remained on the porch, listening to the night sounds of the forest, the hooting of an owl, the distant yip of coyotes, the rustle of creatures moving through underbrush. These sounds that had once seemed alien, even threatening, now felt like the familiar voices of neighbors. In the years since Maple had pulled Emma from the rubble, Sarah had learned to recognize the distinct personalities of individual animals, to read the subtle signs of their emotional states, to appreciate the complex social bonds that existed within and sometimes between species. The world had not magically transformed into a peaceable kingdom. There were still conflicts between humans and wildlife, still habitat destruction and species extinctions and all the challenges that came with sharing a planet under pressure.